the idea there is that as you leave the cave, you go out into the sun, and the sun in the allegory of the cave is representing something real for Plato and Socrates, which is called the form of the good. And a lot of philosophers think this might have a sort of like deistic quality. It's not anthropomorphized in the way that we're familiar with God, in the sense that we don't, the Plato and Socrates wouldn't have made anything human about this concept, right? They wouldn't have given it any sort of human characteristics. That's what anthropomorphize means. So, certainly wouldn't have a human body, wouldn't have human characteristics, right? We wouldn't describe it in that way. But at the time, even postulating a single entity from which everything else created was basically the equivalent of heresy, right? At a time when it was seen that there were many gods, right? Each responsible for their specific domain of creation and ruling the world. So one of the three charges for Socrates technically was a form of religious sort of persecution, and that he was not upholding the dominant religion at the time. There are a lot more examples of natural philosophers being put to death for their challenging of what was seen as dominant religious doctrine at the time, but this ends up being tangential. Like, it's not so much that the natural philosophers or scientists were disproving something in the Bible, or directly saying that something was false, or that there wasn't a God. Like, oftentimes a lot of these people who were put to death were themselves theists, and were in fact monotheists, and many times were in fact Christian, right? But it's that they were putting forth a theory that threatened something about the unique special status of humanity, right? And so the classic example of this is, does anyone know who is responsible for us switching from a geocentric to a heliocentric model of the universe? So the difference from thinking that the Earth is the center of the universe, or of our galaxy, right? The universe, that was as big as our mind was back then, to the sun being the center. Anyone know who was responsible for this paradigm shift? Different way of, oh no, where's our science history at? Galileo, good, thank you. All right, yes, Galileo is very famously known for this. And so Galileo was not, disproving anything about Christianity, but by merely implying that humans were not the center of the universe anymore, this was seen as a threat to Christian creation, right? In that, human beings as the primary creation of God tends to be a very large basis around what a lot of the Christian narrative is centered. And so it raises a lot of questions, like, why did God create us, right? So if we are not the center of the universe, and everything does not actually literally revolve, we use that as sort of a phrase now, like for people who are arrogant, right? Like, the earth doesn't revolve, or the system doesn't revolve around you. That's where this comes from, right? That's where that saying comes from. It's because we literally used to think that everything revolved around us, right? That we were the absolute center of the entire universe. And so switching away from that led to questions about why God or a being would create us, which gets to what we're talking about this week, right? Are going to be not just sorts of questions about what type of God exists, but whether or not even a God could exist, right? And so that's going to be the big difference between, again, what we're doing in philosophy and what you might see in some theology studies, right? So a lot of people who study religion from within a particular religion will be asking these same questions, right? But they would be using, say, biblical or sacred texts to answer those questions. Now, why are we not going to be doing that as philosophers, given what we learned last week? Can anyone guess why we wouldn't be using scripture this week when we're having our conversations about God? Sort of antithetical to most conversations about God. What might scripture already presume is true? God. Yes. Very good. Right. So when we're looking at religious scripture, the reason that philosophers will not be using any of this as evidence, right, or reason or justification in support of their arguments is that exactly right, Lenari. These already presume that they're not just a God, but that their God exists, right? And in philosophy, remember, we don't start from presumptions, right? We are working backwards to try to question the things that we are already presuming to be true. Okay, so if you use scripture to argue for the existence of the God presumed by that scripture to already exist, that's an example of what we would call circular reasoning, right? So you're already assuming the thing I'm trying to prove. I'm trying to prove that God exists in my conclusion, right? I can't then assume that God's existence as one of the premises to then prove God's existence, right? And so using scripture would do that, right? So again, it's not that that's another conversation, what role scripture is going to play, right, in knowledge and religious life. And there are many rich philosophical discussions we can have about that. But the point is, again, we're just not going to be using that as premises, right, reasons to establish. And you're going to see the same thing with the philosophers we're looking at this week. But again, this doesn't mean that these philosophers aren't themselves religious. Pretty much all of them come from the Abrahamic traditions, right? And so these are theists, these are monotheists who are arguing for the existence of God so that they can eventually argue for the existence of their specific conception of God, right? Which is going to have a unique set of attributes.